Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to tonight's talk with Professor Mark Solms. And tonight, Mark will be talking about the ideas from his book, Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. And it's a great privilege to have you here, Mark. So thank you. Just some housekeeping before we start. The structure is going to be, Mark's going to talk probably for around an hour or around that, and then we'll have about half an hour of questions. So there's quite a lot of people, so if you've got questions, post them in the chat box and one of the technical admin will contact you, and then they can either bring you up during the question time onto the screen, or we'll put the question forward to Mark. Okay, so Mark is a psychoanalyst from South Africa. He trained in London, but we'll claim him as a South African psychoanalyst. He's also a neuropsychologist. He's the chair of neuropsychology at UCT and Groote in Cape Town. And he's the founder of neuropsychoanalysis in 2000. He's published probably 250 articles, 6 books, lots of awards. He discovered the brain mechanism for dreaming, and there are really many accolades and things that I could use to introduce Mark, but I think most of you know Mark and his work. But I'm going to go on a personal level. Mark is from South Africa or Southern Africa, and was trained at Wits, which is also my alma mater, and he also came back from London and started SAPA, or South African Psychoanalysis, and set up training here, which is something I'm very grateful for, and many of the candidates who've had the opportunity to train in South Africa not have to go to London, so we could become psychoanalysts. And during one of our SAPA meetings, Mark did a presentation on his book, and it really was very enriching. And I thought it would be really nice to do it for the Facebook community and the social media community. So without further ado, Mark, I'm going to pass on to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm very glad to be here. I must tell you, I'm a member of this Facebook group. So I'm particularly glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen in a second. Before I do, as Mike just told you, I'm going to speak for about an hour. The topic I'm going to speak to, it's via my book, but my book is on a topic called The Hard Problem of Consciousness. And this is an enormously complicated matter. And it's kind of absurd to try to cover everything in an hour. So what I'm going to do, rather than try and cram every single idea I have on the topic in an abbreviated form into that hour, I thought I will talk in a sort of leisurely way. I'll take you through the issues, and we'll get as far as we get. It slowly gets more and more complicated. So if we don't get to the most complicated matters, that's absolutely fine. I'm starting with the more important, more foundational things, and I'll stop within an hour, and then we discuss it. I particularly look forward to the questions and answers. That's of course the most interesting part for me, because I know what I'm going to say, but I don't know what you're going to say. This is my title. That is the title of my book, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. Here we go. Here is the hard problem, as formulated by David Chalmers in '95. He said, it's undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience. But the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience, the quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea? How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or experience an emotion? It's widely agreed that experiences arise from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. So that's the hard problem. And you'll see I emphasize this phrase, something it is like. This is the famous qualia of experience. And this phrase derives from an earlier philosophical paper by Tom Nagel, entitled "What is it like to be a bat?", in which he said an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it's like for the organism. And he went on to say, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue about how this could be done. And so this is what I'm wanting to do in this presentation this evening, is give us a clue about how this could be done. Really, nothing more than a clue. So here's the question, as formulated by Tom Nagel and later by David Chalmers: why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? That's the hard problem, and I'm going to try to give you a clue as to how we might begin to solve this problem. I'm going to do it through a series of cases because I know most of you are clinicians, and I pride myself on being a clinician too. I think it's a little easier for us to do it via a series of cases. The case that I start with is this chap, who actually is my older brother. That's me down there, and this is my brother Lee. Some 4 years after this photograph was taken, my brother fell from a 3-story high building onto his head, fractured his skull, and sustained significant damage to his brain. And I, therefore, at an early age, experienced directly the somehow we are our brains. Because my brother, although he looked the same when he came out of the hospital, he was not the same person. And it was deeply disturbing to try to get my head around what on earth had happened. Who's this guy? Where's my brother? You know, I won't elaborate, but you can imagine for a little child, this clearly is a very disturbing and confusing matter. But it made me aware that somehow it must be the case that we are our brains, that our subjective personality, our mental life is somehow tied up with the functioning of the organ that you see on the screen there. And although I obviously didn't make the decision at the age of 4 or 5 that I'm going to become a neuroscientist, I think it's nevertheless pretty obvious that that is why I did study neuroscience, and in particular neuropsychology. That is to say, that branch of the neurosciences which deals with the problem I've just mentioned. How does it happen? How can it be? How does it work that we, our subjective experiencing selves, are somehow also just a bodily organ? So I went to the university that Mike mentioned, and I trained in neuropsychology, and there I learned things like this, that in the visual cortex, there's the information flows in, from the retina in this incredibly complicated way, and this is how visual information is processed. I won't go into the details of this so-called simplified map of how visual information processing works, but I'll tell you why I have this diagram on the screen. It is that this sort of exemplifies the way in which we conceptualize the mind in the neurosciences. It's by way of these complicated information flow charts. And I freely confess that when I first was exposed to this way of thinking, I thought, but where is the mind in all of this? Meaning, where is the subject that experiences all this information? Where does it all come together in what I thought was the mind, which is subjective being of the mind, the lived experience of mental phenomenology. And when I asked my professors about that, they warmly advised me that you shouldn't ask such questions. They're bad for your career, asking about subjectivity and experience and so on. And the truth is, really, that is why I trained in psychoanalysis. I was so disappointed by the lack of any psyche in neuropsychology that I jumped ship. I didn't entirely jump ship. I kept one foot in each ship, but recognized that psychoanalysis, for all of its own faults, at least takes as its starting point the actual lived life of the mind. So this diagram and this little story that I'm telling you really cuts to the heart of the hard problem. So here's David Chalmers again. He says the easy problems are easy precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. Functions like this, you see, functional maps of how the function works. To explain a cognitive function, we need only specify a mechanism that can perform the function. The methods of cognitive science are well suited for this sort of explanation, and so are well suited to the easy problems of consciousness. By contrast, the hard problem is hard, precisely because it is not a problem about the performance of functions. The problem persists even when the performance of all the relevant functions is explained. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even when we've explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? The simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? That flow chart that I showed you, the information processing that goes on in the visual cortex, you have similar flow charts which explain the functionality, the mechanism of how a camera works or how your mobile phone works. Our mobile phones also have visual information processing. In fact, not only can they process visual information, they can recognize things like faces, as you might have noticed, and they can store that visual information in memory. So this is what Chalmers is talking about. You know, since our phones can do these sorts of things, and since the kind of models, these functional mechanistic accounts of the mind that pervade cognitive neuroscience, since the very same type of explanation can be used for non-sentient things like computers and phones and whatnot, it raises the question, why do we have experience at all? What does it add? What does it do? And also, how does it come about? How is it possible that these functional mechanisms give rise to subjective experience? So that is, as I keep saying, that is the hard problem. That's what we're talking about now. To give you a sense of the gravity of the problem, I want to tell you about what another philosopher, Frank Jackson, said. It goes under the heading of the knowledge argument. I'm going to give it to you in a simplified form. Jackson says, imagine a visual neuroscientist named Mary. Mary knows everything there is to know about the functional mechanisms of vision. She knows all about the physics of light waves and how they're transduced by the rods and cones in the retina of your eyes into nerve impulses, which get transmitted physiologically to the lateral geniculate body, and from there to the visual cortex, where it is further processed in the complicated ways I showed you in that diagram. She knows all of this. She knows everything there is to know about the functional mechanism of vision. But Mary is blind. So despite knowing all about the functional mechanism, she's never actually experienced vision. And then one day, thanks be to God, the gift of sight is bestowed upon her. And so for the first time, she actually has visual experience. And Jackson's argument is that at this point, Mary will learn something utterly new about vision. She will learn something about what it is like to experience the color blue as opposed to the color red. There was nothing, this is the point, there was nothing in her functional mechanistic knowledge about visual information processing that prepared her for, or explained, or even predicted that there would be something it is like to see. So this, according to Jackson, shows us that the phenomenology, the qualia, the actual experiencing of vision, the actual stuff of sentient being exists in some other sphere. It exists, it's not accounted for by, explained by, predicted by, in any way adequately dealt with by the cognitive, functional, mechanistic ways of explaining things that we use in the neurosciences and in neuropsychology in particular. Please remember the gravity of the problem, because it really would be a very serious matter if mental life existed in some other universe from the rest of the natural world. That's what's at stake here. So the phrase that Chalmers used, I want to put this on the screen in big letters too, so that we understand again what it is we're dealing with here, what the hard problem is. He says, why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? So let's see if we can make some progress with this question. I have to say, I have some sympathy with Chalmers. You might be surprised to hear, I have some sympathy with this perplexity that he expresses as to why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark? Why doesn't all this stuff that the visual cortex does go on in the dark in the same way as it does in our mobile phones? Why do we have to have experience? Why do we experience vision? Why is there a qualitative feel to visual experience? And I'm using vision as my model example because it has become the model example in our quest to come to grips with the problem of consciousness in neuroscience. But the same could be said of any other modality of perception. The article that I have on the screen by John Kilstrom, it's a famous article. The title says it all. Perception without awareness of what is perceived, learning without awareness of what is learned. It's an article that summarizes everything that we understood in the 1980s and 1990s in neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience about unconscious cognition. We in psychoanalysis knew about all of this 100 years earlier, but in the late 20th century, cognitive science came to the conclusion on the basis of oodles of experimental evidence that things like vision do not necessarily have to be conscious, that our visual cortex is perfectly capable of processing information in very complex ways. For example, we can recognize faces and we can read words and our behavior is influenced by that complex visual information processing, even though we have no awareness whatsoever that we've perceived anything. The sorts of experimental evidence I'm talking about are things like tachistoscopic studies, where information is flashed for just a few milliseconds. So you're not aware of having experienced anything. And yet it's possible to show experimentally that the person has been influenced by what they read and what they saw. And this sort of visual information processing is is intrinsically cortical. Only the visual cortex can process faces and words and read them with comprehension. And clearly, these experiments show us that this sort of thing can happen unconsciously. Reading with comprehension is a uniquely human cortical function. So if these even uniquely human cortical functions, cognitive functions like reading, can be performed without consciousness, I think that it makes it a very legitimate question. Well, what the hell does the consciousness add? What is it for? It's such a troublesome thing. Why do we have it? How does it come about? That's why I say I have some sympathy with Chalmers's way of formulating the problem. I'm now going to argue that the problem with all of this is precisely the fact that we have been focusing on the cortex. I've just been talking to you about the visual cortex, which performs visual, cognitive, perceptual functions. But the same applies to the whole of the cortex. We've assumed that the cortex, with its cognitive functions, is the seat of consciousness, and we've assumed this for more than a century. And I'm going to try to persuade you that that's why we've had such difficulty with this hard problem. We've been looking in the wrong place. By using cortical visual information processing as our model example of consciousness, we've been looking in the wrong place because cortical visual information processing is not intrinsically conscious. It doesn't have to be conscious. And so that's why the problem arises. That's why we find ourselves having to ask the question, well, what the hell does the consciousness add? What is it for? It doesn't seem to do anything. It doesn't seem to be part and parcel of what this cortical visual information processing device is all about. I agree that it doesn't seem to be, because I don't believe that consciousness is bound up fundamentally with cortex. I think that that consciousness is bound up fundamentally with the functioning of the brain stem. And so that's what I'm now going to try to argue. Remember, I told you I'm not going to rush. I'm trying to go through these things at a pace that makes it possible for me to explain myself clearly. And so let's see how far I can get in unpacking the evidence for you within the time remaining to me. The evidence for the view that the cortex is not the seat of consciousness. So here comes case two. When I say the cortex, in fact, the standard view as to where, remember what I asked my professors when I was a student. I said, all this visual information that comes in via the occipital lobe, where is the sentient subject that receives all this information, that experiences all this information? And the mainstream view, not to put too fine a point on it, is, well, it all comes together in the prefrontal lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. So if you have to try to localize where the global workspace, as they call it, of consciousness is located, or where this information is accessed, as other theorists put it. If you have to localize this anywhere in the cortex, it's in the prefrontal lobes, which incidentally is also our evolutionary pride and joy. Us human beings have more highly developed prefrontal cortex than any other primate, let alone any other mammal. So if this is where the sentient subject resides, in the prefrontal cortex of the hemispheres, then that gives rise to a falsifiable prediction. If you remove the prefrontal cortex, then you should be able to demonstrate that there's no longer a sentient being there. The subject should be obliterated by such a lesion. Of course, we don't experimentally remove cortex in human beings, but there are a few cases, very few cases, in which there is total obliteration of the prefrontal cortex due to natural disease, and they give us an opportunity to test that prediction. Is there a self there when there's no prefrontal cortex? So I have such a patient. His name is Mr. W. And as you can see on this scan, He has absolutely no in fact, you can see it even more clearly on this scan. He has absolutely no prefrontal lobes. I won't go into all the medical details about how this came about, but he has tiny strip here of language cortex, which makes him able to speak. And so it was possible for me to interview him about what it is like to live with no prefrontal cortex. I asked him, are you consciously aware of your thoughts? And he said, yes, of course I am. So I asked him to confirm that by thinking, by conjuring up a mental image in his mind that I could then get him to do some mental work with, to see whether he's able to picture in his mind's eye a scenario. I said, imagine that you have 2 dogs and 1 chicken. He says, okay. I said, do you see them in your mind's eye? He says, yes. And then I said, now tell me, how many legs do you see in total? Think about it. There's 2 dogs and 1 chicken. This is not an everyday problem. We don't normally think about such things. So I was expecting that now he would be surveying the mental imagery in his mind and counting the legs. And if he could come up with the right answer, this would show that he is indeed able to have mental imagery, in other words, visual experience, and to report on it that there's a sentient subject there having this experience. And so you can imagine my disappointment when his answer to my question was 8. The answer, of course, is 10. So I said 8, and he said, yes, the dogs ate the chicken. So it might not be the best joke in the world, but I hope you will agree with me that it's evidence that there's somebody at home here. There is an experiencing subject of the mind of Mr. W. So much so that he's not only able to look at these mental images that he's experiencing, but even to try to turn it into a joke. So I think I'm just giving you illustrative examples of the kind of evidence against the view that the cortex is the seat of consciousness. I told you that the prefrontal cortex is supposed to be the overarching superstructure that has access to all the information processing going on in the cortex. And yet patients who have no prefrontal lobes seem to be consciously present as sentient beings in the world. Now, there's one other thing I want to tell you about these patients like my Mr. W. I want to mention what their emotional life is like, because this turns out to be important. Some theorists, in fact, the mainstream of cognitive neuroscientists tell us that consciousness only comes about when it enters this global workspace, when it's accessed by the prefrontal cortex, and this includes emotion. That you only feel everything's unconscious until it's labeled by prefrontal cortex. So you name this thing. Oh, I'm experiencing fear, and it's only at that point that the fear actually comes into existence as a conscious experience. And the fact is that with these patients with prefrontal cortical damage, if that were true, they should have less emotions, they should have less affectivity, but in fact, the very opposite is the case. It's been known for a very long time that patients with prefrontal cortical damage, like my own brother, they are highly emotional. In fact, they are described as disinhibited. They are overwhelmed by emotion. So how can the prefrontal cortex generate emotion if when it's removed, rather than having less of it, you have more? And now I'm going to tell you about the other main contender in the cognitive neuroscience world for the physiological substrate of consciousness, in this mainstream view that consciousness is bound up with the cortex. And that is the view that that consciousness, especially in the sense that I've just mentioned now, that is conscious feeling, is generated in this part of the cortex, which is called the insula. And this view is associated, was pioneered by the neuroscientist Bud Craig. He says that the insular cortex is where you become aware of basic feelings, which is, I would agree with him, the foundation, surely, of conscious being. Now, if this were true, if this cortical theory were true, then it gives rise again to a falsifiable prediction, which is that patients who have no insula should be unconscious. And yet that's not what happens. Here's a patient with absolutely no cortex. This was a patient of my colleague Antonio Damasio, and Damasio interviewed this patient in much the same way as I interviewed patient W. And he asks him all sorts of questions about whether he has a mind or not, and so on. And it's clear from his answers that, again, as there was with my patient, that there is a sentient, subjective being present in the case of patient B. Damasio says, what if I were to tell you that I know you better than you know yourself? The patient says, I would think you are wrong. Please note the reference to I. That's who he is. That's who he's experiencing. He says, I would think you're wrong. Damasio says, what if I were to tell you that you're aware that I'm aware? The patient said, I would say you're right. Damasio said, you're aware that I'm aware? The patient says, again, somewhat jokingly, I'm aware that you're aware that I'm aware. So again, remember, I'm just giving you illustrative examples, but I think that these two examples are enough to make the point that it's very hard to sustain the view that the prefrontal cortex or the insular cortex is where subjective experience comes about. Clearly, in these two cases, where there is total obliteration of the prefrontal cortex and total obliteration of the insula, clearly in these two cases, there is still a sentient subjectivity present. So the only remaining argument is, well, that's because they still have some cortex. The consciousness must be arising from the remainder of the cortex in cases like this. So let's have a look at what happens in cases where absolutely no cortex is present. Here is such a case. This is a little girl whose brain stem, you will see, is perfectly intact, and the cerebellum, which hangs off the back of the brain stem, is perfectly intact. But where the cortex should be, there is only fluid. This child was born with no cortex. The condition is known as hydranencephaly. So if the cortex is a prerequisite, is the seat of conscious experience, this child should be in a coma. Let me introduce you to her. Here she is. As you can see, she's anything but in a coma. She's a wide awake. She goes to sleep at night. She wakes up in the morning. So in that sense, she's conscious. But much more interestingly than that, when her baby brother is placed on her lap, she responds emotionally. She goes, ah, she likes it. There's an expression of an emotion, an emotional response to this experience. And the same applies to all sorts of other experiences. Here's another such child. They respond with fear when they are frightened. They respond with anger when they are frustrated, with startle when they are surprised, with pleasure when they are tickled, and so on. So really, I need to hammer home this point because it's crucially important. These are children who have no cortex. All that is functional here, I'll show you the scan again. Here is this child has a brainstem. She has a brainstem with a cerebellum, but she doesn't have cortex. And the theory that we've had for more than 100 years of neuroscience is that consciousness is bound up with the cortex. And yet in children like these with no cortex, they patently are conscious. And most importantly of all, because I freely accept that they can't possibly be generating conscious visual images or conscious perception of any kind, let alone complex cognitions derived from those perceptions, because they don't have the machinery for it. They don't have cortex. But I do not accept that they're not conscious. And moreover, very importantly, it's clearly the case that they are affectively conscious. They're emotionally conscious. And that's a terribly important conclusion. Remember, I'm saying we've been looking in the wrong place in trying to find the seat of consciousness. We've been looking in the cortex to these higher cognitive functions. And I think this sort of evidence shows us that consciousness is not bound up with those higher cognitive functions, which patients like the two I've just shown you are utterly incapable of. They don't have cortex, yet they have consciousness, and their consciousness has an affective form. And I think that's where we should have been looking in the first place. Now, I must tell you, when I present evidence of this kind, of the kind I'm presenting to you now, to my neuroscientific colleagues, they say, well, how do you know that this girl is conscious? How do you know? What do they expect? What they expect is the girl must say, I am happy. You know, the fact that she just shows she's happy is not enough unless she declares, and this is literally the criterion they use, that the patient must be able to report on their subjective states. If they can't report on them, then we have no empirical evidence that they're there. That's why I started by showing you my patient W, who could report in the absence of any prefrontal cortex on his mental states. And I followed that with Damasio's patient B, who had no insular cortex, but did still have language cortex, and so he could report on his mental states. And now I'm showing you cases who clearly can't report on their mental states. But the reason I'm showing you these cases is to counteract the argument that why patients W and B are able to have experiences because they have some cortex. I'm showing you in cases where there is no cortex, still you can see behavioral evidence of affective, emotional consciousness, sentient being, presence of mind. But of course, in these cases, it's not possible for them to report it. So, my colleagues are sort of wanting to have their cake and eat it too, by saying in the cases like B and W, that the consciousness must be in the remaining part of the cortex. And in cases like these two kids, they're saying, well, because they can't report, because they've got no cortex, we can't know that they're conscious. I think that's an extreme form of skepticism. But what we do in science is we then look for other lines of evidence. If in cases like this, where there's no cortex, there's no possibility of them reporting on the fact that with only a brain stem, you can have feelings. If they can't report, then let's use other methods to see what evidence there is for the presence, for the generating of feelings in the brainstem. I'm not going to talk about this slide. This is just a summary of what these kids are like. The two kids I just showed you. It highlights the fact that they're full of feeling. We in fact knew since the 1940s, we've known that consciousness as a whole is dependent upon the brainstem. In 1948, it was shown that if these structures, these purple structures known as the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray or PAG, that if these structures are separated from the cortex, then the cortex is not conscious. The cortex cannot operate consciously unless it is aroused by these brainstem structures. That I said we've known since 1948, but we were told at that time, and we've believed for decades since, that this part of the brain is just like a power supply. It doesn't really generate qualitative contents of consciousness. That we believed remains the preserve of cortex. And we were told that what this part of the brain supplies is some kind of quantitative level, some sort of background wakefulness, which makes the actual business of the qualitative contents of consciousness possible. The analogy that's frequently used to explain this way of thinking is that the cortex is like a television set. And of course, a television set can't function unless it's plugged in at the wall. So the brain stem is like the electrical supply, the power supply to the television set. It's a necessary prerequisite for the television set to do its televisual thing. But on this basis, the fact that it's a necessary prerequisite, it would be absurd to claim that really television comes from the power supply. This is the argument. The argument is it simply, enables the television set to do television stuff. And so the view is that the cortex is really where it's at. It's really where the contents and qualities are generated. And the brainstem just provides the background power supply. So that's what I'm now arguing against. I'm showing you that this part of the brain is doesn't just provide a level or a quantity of arousal without any quality and without any content. I'm saying that these kids who have only a brain stem, clearly they have a quality and a content to their mental experience. And that quality and content is called feeling, is called affect. So I'm saying that this necessary prerequisite, I want to really emphasize this point, the necessary prerequisite for consciousness that we've recognized since the 1940s, that you can't have cortical and cognitive consciousness unless you have brainstem arousal. I'm saying that this necessary prerequisite is consciousness itself. It does have quality and it does have content, and that foundational elemental prerequisite for experience is feeling. So I'm arguing that we sentient beings are literally constituted by feeling, by affective feeling. And I now come back to the point that my colleagues say, well, how do you know that kids like this are having feelings? They just look as if they're having feelings. They can't report them, so we can't be sure. So as I said, I want to show you other lines of evidence. So here comes my next case. This is a patient who has no psychiatric history, but she has a neurological disease, Parkinson's disease. And one of the ways in which Parkinson's disease is treated these days is you put a deep brain stimulator into a structure over here called the subthalamic nucleus. So in this patient, her Parkinson's disease was treated by such a deep brain stimulator, but the surgeon, in inserting the electrode, went just a few millimeters too deep into a structure called the substantia nigra, which is part of the reticular activating system. Substantia nigra is located there, part of the reticular activating system. And so the surgeon stimulated this reticular activating nucleus. And if these nuclei are responsible for generating feelings, then stimulating that nucleus should switch on a feeling. That would be the prediction from the theory that affects, feelings are actually generated by these nuclei. If you artificially stimulate one of these nuclei, you should be able to generate a feeling. And importantly, this patient has cortex. So she can tell us what happens, what it is like to have your reticular activating system stimulated. Remember, what I'm trying to show you is if we use other methods to get around the problem that those kids without cortex can't tell us what it is like to be them. That's why we're using these other methods. And this is the method of deep brain stimulation. So what happens when the substantia nigra is stimulated? This is what happens. The patient expressed profound sadness within 5 seconds of the stimulator being switched on. Although still alert, the patient leaned to the right, started to cry, and verbally communicated feelings of sadness, guilt, uselessness, and hopelessness, such as I'm falling down in my head, I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything. When asked why she was crying and if she felt pain, she responded, no, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything's useless, always feeling worthless. I'm scared in this world. When asked why she was sad, she replied, I'm tired. I want to hide in a corner. I'm crying over myself, of course. I'm hopeless. Why am I bothering you? What is this, dear colleagues? It's depression, profound suicidal depression, switched on within 5 seconds by stimulating one of the nuclei of the reticular activating system. And that depression disappeared 90 seconds after the stimulation was stopped. And the patient was very kind enough, generous enough, brave enough to allow the surgeon Blomstedt to allow him to then randomly stimulate either in the reticular activating system or out of it, in the substantia nigra or in the subthalamic nucleus, without her knowing where the stimulus was switched on. And every time he switched on the stimulator in the substantia nigra, the patient fell back into this profound depression. So this shows that you can actually generate intense affects by stimulating these brainstem nuclei. Now, I want to show you another line of evidence which demonstrates the same thing. There's a method called positron emission tomography, which allows you to image what's going on in the brain in real time in a living patient. And you can image what part of the brain is activated when they are in one or another mental state. So my colleague Damasio imaged people who were in intense emotional states to see where the activation in the brain was that coincided with those intense emotional states. And the prediction, if the feelings are generated in the brain stem, then the activation should be in the brain stem. If the feelings are generated in the cortex, as is the standard view, then the activation should be in the cortex. So let's see what happens. Here are the scans from Damasio's study. These are research participants who are in the scanner in intense emotional states of sadness, anger, happiness, and fear. And in all of these emotional states, you see the activation, that's the red part. The activation is not in the cortex. The cool colors mean deactivation. The warm colors mean activation. So the activation is not in the cortex, it's in the brain stem, in anger and sadness and happiness and fear, exactly as would be predicted. And one last bit of evidence, the drugs that psychiatrists use to treat depression or to treat psychosis or to treat anxiety, they manipulate the neurotransmitters that are sourced in the reticular activating system. If the reticular activating system were only responsible for blank wakefulness or some kind of quantitative level of arousal, then it would be of interest only to anesthetists. And yet, common and garden psychopharmaceuticals act on the neurotransmitters that are sourced in the reticular activating system. Antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs. So clearly manipulating the chemistries of these reticular activating neurons, manipulates feeling states, manipulates emotional affects. And so I submit that all of this evidence combined, I don't see how we can escape the conclusion that consciousness is not generated in the cortex. Consciousness is generated in the brainstem, and consciousness is not fundamentally a cognitive thing, because remember, the brainstem arousal is a necessary prerequisite for any kind of cortical and cognitive consciousness. So I'm saying the foundational, fundamental, elemental, prerequisite form of consciousness, of generating sentient being in the world, is the brainstem and is affective feeling. And that's why I'm saying we've been looking in the wrong place in trying to identify the brain basis of consciousness by looking to cortex, by looking to perception and cognition. We should have been looking in a far more ancient structure, far more a basic structure, that is the brainstem, with far more foundational functions, namely the generation of affective feeling. Now, interestingly, our Sigmund Freud, the discoverer of the unconscious, who discovered the unconscious 100 years before cognitive neuroscience caught up with the realization that most of our cognition, most of the cortical mantl's information processing goes on unconsciously. Freud, who was the first to realize this, that most of our cognition in fact goes on unconsciously, the discoverer of the unconscious, this same Freud says that when it comes to feelings, things are quite different. He says it's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. So Freud, the discoverer of the unconscious, says, yes, you can have unconscious cognitions, but you can't have unconscious feelings. I've emboldened the word feelings because I know some people speak of unconscious emotions and unconscious affects. I know such things exist. We all know about defense mechanisms and whatnot. I'm emphasizing the word feelings because in the case of feelings, there's no possibility. You cannot speak of a feeling that you don't feel. It's an oxymoron. So this is the aspect of affectivity that I'm talking about. I'm saying that, and please let me emphasize this because it's my absolute main point of this talk. I'm saying that if we're wanting to identify the functional mechanism of consciousness, we shouldn't be looking to perceptual and cognitive processes which do not require consciousness to go on, which for the most part do carry on unconsciously. Rather, we should be looking to the functional mechanism of feelings, because feelings are intrinsically conscious. And so clearly, surely, this is the right place to look in order to try to begin to solve the hard problem of consciousness. I say once more, we've been looking in the wrong place. We've been looking at the wrong type of mentation. We've been looking to cortical cognition, and we should have been looking at brainstem affect, because this is the basic form of consciousness. Remember, I told you when I mentioned what we discovered in 1948, that what the reticular activating system does, its essential function, is to arouse consciousness. Surely this is the place we should have been looking. And the reason we didn't is because we were misled by the idea that it's just a power supply. It's just a sort of extrinsic prerequisite that the real conscious stuff happens in the cortex. I hope by now I've been able to persuade you that that's just not true. Let's go back to David Chalmers again. I'm not going to read you this whole thing because I see I only have a little over 10 minutes or about 10 minutes left. Chalmers says, there is no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. So this is a reiteration of what he said earlier in the other quotation that I showed you. That's the essence of what his argument is about. He's saying that, explaining cognitive functions does not explain experience. Now, what if you change this word cognitive to affective? It becomes quite a different story. Imagine if Chalmers were to try to argue there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. I'm saying there is. I'm saying that the function of feeling, we can say in advance that explanation of the function of feeling will automatically explain experience, because the function of feeling is all about feeling. You can't have this function called feeling without feeling it. And I hope you recognize I'm not making a semantic point. I'm saying that part of the brain stem, which generates this arousal, this necessary prerequisite for any kind of experience, that it generates feelings. That's what I've just been showing you. That's the empirical evidence. And so I say again, it's not a semantic point when I say that we should be looking, if you can explain the function of feeling, then you necessarily are explaining the function of consciousness, because feeling is the foundational form and it is intrinsically conscious. It's necessarily conscious. So what is the function of feeling? It functions according to a really quite simple mechanism called homeostasis. Homeostasis is absolutely essential for life. All living things function according to the biological principle of homeostasis, which states that there are certain physiological parameters that we have to remain within in order to stay alive. So, for example, you need a certain body temperature, a certain sugar level, a certain blood pressure, a certain level of hydration, a certain pH, etc. If you move out of these viable bounds, you die. So to go back to the example that I started with of core body temperature, in Celsius, if you measure it in degrees Celsius, you have to remain between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. If you move out of that range, you're at risk of dying. If you get very much hotter than that, you die. If you get very much colder than that, you die. So when you deviate, it's called a homeostatic error signal. When you transcend your viable bounds, when you move beyond your settling point, it's a demand on the body to perform work. You have to do something about it. And we have reflexes that are predicted to return you to your viable bounds. So for example, in the case of being too hot, you have reflexes which make you perspire and pant, and this cools you down. And that's the work that needs to be performed in order to get you back within your viable bounds. And the same applies to all of these basic bodily mechanisms. Now, feeling builds upon this by enabling us to experience that we are moving out of our viable bounds, and we experience it as an unpleasant feeling. Unpleasant feelings mean this is bad for me. What I'm doing is unsustainable. It's incompatible with life. I'm getting too hot. I'm getting dehydrated. My blood sugar is plummeting, etc. And why it's important to be able to feel that this is happening is that if you don't have a ready built prediction like a reflex, if there isn't an automatic way of dealing with the situation, then feeling enables you to navigate whether what you're doing is working or not. So it enables you to survive in unpredicted, uncertain environments, and God knows there are many of those in life. So this is what feeling adds, this enormous adaptive advantage. It enables us to know how we're doing within a biological scale of values, that biological scale being that it is good to survive and bad to die. Good feelings, pleasurable ones, say, I'm not going to die. Bad feelings, unpleasurable ones, say, carry on in this direction, mate, and you're at risk of dying. So this feeling of how we're doing enables us to make choices, as opposed to autonomic functions like blood pressure regulation. It enables us to feel our way through the problem. Choice is the foundation of voluntary behavior. And what I'm saying is that feeling enables us to make choices, and it enables voluntary behavior, that is to say, navigating uncertainty. Choice has to be grounded in a value system. There has to be something that's better and something that's worse. Otherwise, how do you make a decision? That would be random. So the choices are made on the basis of feelings, on what's good and what's bad, what's pleasurable and what's unpleasurable. So take the example of, I like to use the example of respiratory control, which is normally autonomic. You're not aware of your need to breathe until you get into a situation of uncertainty. Like, for example, you're in a carbon dioxide filled room. You've never been in a burning building before, let alone this particular one. So you have no basis for knowing what to do. And feeling enables you, the air hunger, that suffocation alarm. Now your need to breathe has become conscious. How you're doing in terms of your blood gases has become conscious in the form of feelings. And if you move in the wrong direction, say, for example, you go upstairs in the burning building, then the increasing unpleasure of suffocation alarm tells you you've made the wrong choice. If conversely you go downstairs, which happens to be the right way to go, because there's more oxygen there, you feel it. And you feel it in the relief of being able to breathe. And that, I'm saying, is the function of feeling. That's what feeling does. That's what it's for. It's not something you can do without. And I've talked here about bodily feelings, but the same applies to emotional feelings. We need to stay safe. If you're not safe, you feel fear. We need to not have frustrating obstacles impeding us from getting what we want. If you do have such obstacles, you feel rage. and the same applies to separation distress and so on. Emotional feelings work according to homeostasis too. I've added here that this happens across multiple categorical variables because each feeling feels different. They all have a valence, a pleasure and an unpleasure. But the quality of that unpleasure, the quality of fear is quite different from the quality of rage, from the quality of lust, from the quality of separation, distress, etc. And likewise with our bodily feelings, needing to urinate feels quite different from needing to breathe, feels quite different from needing to sleep, and so on. So this, my dear colleagues, is my essential argument that the function of consciousness is the function of feeling. The foundational form of consciousness is feeling. And feeling enables us to feel our way through life's problems, to navigate uncertainty. And our cognitions become conscious so that we can feel our way through the problem. That the consciousness, the feeling, is extended onto cognition, which is otherwise unconscious. As we know, it can function automatically. And for the very most part, it does. And the feeling is what sheds light on, what inserts you into your cognitions so that you are feeling your way through the problems, that these are the demands for work, the affects, and the cognition, the conscious cognition is the work so demanded. Now, I've run out of time. I told you I don't mind if that happens because I've got to cross the main points that I wanted to, that I believe that this argument that functional explanations will never account for why there's something it is like to be a sentient creature. Remember that why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism. I think that question is not so perplexing when you apply it not to visual and other cognitive forms of information processing, but rather to affective feelings. So I'm not going to go through the rest of my talk. I'm just going to come to my very final slide, which is to remind you the other way of putting the question: why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? Well, the processing of feelings can't go on in the dark, free of any inner field. And remember also that I aimed only to give you a clue. I think this is the direction that we should be taking if we're going to solve the hard problem. Thanks very much. Now we have time for questions. Great.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. There's we've got quite a few questions, but I was just a quick thought. I was thinking, a colleague of ours, Yuri Fodor, often says in analysis, the thing you're tracking or the road you're following, the lines you're following is the feelings of the person. And I was thinking about that, and also how in psychoanalysis in some way is about a person's subjectivity. So if that is the feelings, then I thought that fitted quite well.
Absolutely. Look, Mike, I'm very mindful of the fact that I've been talking to a largely psychoanalytic audience about neuroscientific matters. I had to get across those basic arguments, but the implications for psychoanalysis of the kind that you've just mentioned, I think I hope are self-evident. This view that really the absolute guiding principle of mental life is feeling is entirely commensurate with, I mean, when we speak of psychodynamics, we're talking about the dynamics of the psyche as regulated by feeling. It's all about feeling. So this way of thinking about the mind, I think, is very deeply compatible with the prioritizing of affect, the affective side, the side that is so sorely neglected in the cognitive sciences.
I'm going to go to the first question. It's Leila Zahava from Tbilisi in Georgia. I hope I said your name and where you're from correctly.
It's okay. You did, but it's okay. Hello. Hello. Thank you for the organizers for organizing this event. And thank you, Mr. Mark Solms, for very interesting presentation. I had a question which I got an answer like partially, but I would like to ask once again. I'm not a psychoanalytic. I'm not into psychoanalytics. I'm a neuropsychologist actually, but I'm not a practitioner right now. But for me, I got to know your work from your book, Clinical Studies on Neuropsychoanalysis, and I loved the book actually, and it was very interesting point of view. And my question at this point would be, at the time when you were speaking, was that I mean, everything is clear on a mechanical side of what you are saying, but I would touch on a subject that how does knowing the localization of the consciousness help us to know why this experience appears at all? I mean, you mentioned that it's a reticular activating system, which is connected to the frontal brain, but what does it tell us about the why we experience these things? Because it's particularly interesting for me because your discontent with the neuroscience was my discontent with neuropsychology. Because it's very much mechanistic and there's no psyche very much into this. So you begin your discussion with that you were disappointed and you wanted to interconnect these two fields. So my question is regarding how does the localization and function respond to the question why, because it's often brain mind discussion that we often have. So that's my question. Maybe it's too heady and too deep, so
no, it's not.
Whenever however and whenever you like.
No, it's a terribly important basic question. So Chalmers says that the easy problem is precisely one of localization, in other words, correlation, saying that here is a mental experience and it correlates with this physiological process. And the point is, well, so what? So there's something going on physiologically over there. But how does that actually produce an experience? The question is not where. It's not a localization question. It's how and why. So for me, that's the important thing. By identifying what that part of the brain does, not where it is, but what it does. What it does is it regulates our homeostasis. It regulates our homeostasis in this special way where we living creatures come to know, come to experience qualitatively something that matters to us because our very existence depends upon it. How we're doing in terms of our basic biological values. So it's not a matter of where it happens. It's by identifying where it happens, it enables us to pick apart why and how it happens. So my argument is, and when I say my argument, I must also add, it's not, thankfully, not me alone. There are a small group of us, starting with our dear late colleague Jaak Panksepp, and then Antonio Damasio and Bjorn Merker. These are the pioneers of this view. I'm building on their shoulders. So we're of the view that we need a radical reconceptualization of what consciousness actually is and what it's actually for. What it is for is the business that I've just mentioned. That's what it does. It's what its actual causal contribution to the organism is. And I think that this is how and why sentient subjectivity comes about. Then there's the secondary matter of, so first it is, I feel like this, good or bad, in this or that category of feeling about that. And it's the extending of feeling onto cognition is how and why the cognitions become conscious. So what you're a neuropsychologist, so we were always taught that the reticular activating system arouses the cortex and activates and modulates these cortical processes. And I'm saying that arousal, that modulation, that activating of cortex is literally a feeling our way into a palpating of those cognitions with feeling. That the basic form of consciousness is feeling. So it's really not a matter of localization, Leila. It's a matter of understanding what consciousness actually is, what it's for, what it does. And it's a radical reorientation. And that helped me to overcome my disappointment with neuropsychology. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leila. Okay, next we've got Paul Eric Adamson, who's got a question. There we go.
Hi, Mark. My question is about subconscious. That Freud changed later to unconscious.
Paul, you've got two different. You're on the screen in two places, and they're reverberating with each other. So yeah, there, good. The other one's say it again, please.
Retirement. Not good with these buttons. Okay. For therapists, it makes sense. That is still okay. But for evolutionary perspective, I've actually forwarded the question to Yvonne.
Yeah.
Well, maybe she can.
Let me read. That's Paul. Let me read it to Mark. Okay. So what Paul's asking in earlier works, Freud used the term subconscious. Laplanche and Pontilus give an explanation that he was trying to reject the topographic association based on the sub and supra that some smart guys were immediately developing. Laplanche and Pontilus refer, for example, on the interpretation of dreams. From the unconscious works just well, but from the evolutionary perspective, it confuses me a bit, since consciousness seems to be a gradualist phenomenon based on the understanding of drives and mechanisms. In this context, the opposition based on the in inverted commas, does not work well, in my opinion. Although we consider under consciousness something anthropomorphic, and our past is definitely different, but it still remains integral part of today. It is not in inverted commas that was there before. The phylogenetic component is still here on the very root level and manifesting today. Would it make sense to use subconscious in an evolutionary context? And he says, sorry, it's so long. And he also said to me that he's a pensioner and the struggling with the technology. But thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. You know, there are many ways in which one can address this question, either scholastically in terms of why Freud rejected the term subconscious and rather wanted to use the word unconscious, or one can approach it phenomenologically, or one can approach it in terms of the various usages of these words within contemporary neuroscience. You know, it's really a range of different issues that you raise. I think that the term non-conscious, I can only explain why I use the terms that I do. I use the term non-conscious for bodily processes, autonomic processes, which have nothing whatsoever to do with the mind. Then there are demands upon the mind for work. In other words, these are not autonomic functions. These are not automatic functions. These are problems that we need to solve, life's problems. The consciousness plays a crucial part in that for the reasons that I explained. Consciousness enables us to make choices. And this is an terribly important function. And I'm going to link it to what psychoanalytical psychotherapy is about in a moment. And then once we've made those choices, we can learn from experience. Then we can lay down predictions. In other words, on the memory is about the past, but it's for the future. So, the whole point of learning from experience is to be able to predict what to do in future, what works and what doesn't work. So once consciousness has done its job, then it's no longer, it doesn't have to remain present. So then you have mental processes. They're not the same as autonomic processes. These are the products of mental work, which then get deposited in the unconscious, which then functions automatically. So I think that's different from non-conscious. It means that mental processes which are not conscious. That's the way that I use the word unconscious, as it is separate from the various usages that everyone has their own sort of definitions of these things, and separate from Freud's argumentation, which had a lot to do with, it's not a matter of subconscious, which kind of like implies not yet conscious, it's something which aspires to consciousness, which is less than consciousness. Freud's whole argument was that the unconscious is a very active place, and it in very large part runs the show. And so this was one of the things he had against the term subconscious. But I want to, while I'm speaking about this, just squeeze in this point about the implications for our therapy. The whole question of whether a mental process is conscious or not, it's not just a qualitative issue. It's not just a matter of, are you phenomenologically aware or not phenomenologically aware of this mental process? It actually is a different functionality. When I said in my talk that the function of consciousness in the sense of feeling is to be able to make choices which have to be rooted in a value system. That's what once things are not conscious and have been relegated to automaticity, which is how the unconscious functions, then you have no, what Freud called das Ich, the I, me, I have no part to play in the matter anymore. So then things just, they compulsively, stereotypically, automatically repeated. And this has got everything to do with psychopathology. Our patients our beloved selves too, not being masters of our own mental house. So the whole aim of psychoanalytical treatment is to raise our intentionality to the level of consciousness so that we can choose to do what we do rather than just have it shoot through us. So a little bit of a ramble, Paul, in response to your question, but that's because it's such a rich question. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, question from Terry Muldoon. And again, I hope I said the surname right. Okay, yeah. Terry.
Thanks for an amazing talk. I am an anesthetist and a pain doctor, so my understanding of this may be not as good as yours. In fact, it isn't. It definitely isn't. But what I wondered as you were talking, first question was, there have been recent reports of patients where they've used, I think, EMGs and EEGs to communicate with locked-in patients who were able. So I imagine locked-in syndrome is a brainstem disorder, and these patients were able to express conscious desire, for example, asking for a beer. So that was one point that came to me as you were speaking, that there appears to be some form of conscious entity that exists in the context of brainstem disorder, or it may not be a complete brainstem loss. The next thing is, I remember Ian McGilchrist's books, The Master and His Emissary, talking about calosotomy patients who post-calosotomy had no recognition of the change in the qualia of their consciousness. And yet there were changes in the nature of their consciousness. So what I was wondering is, while the essence of consciousness may exist at the brainstem level, as you're pointing out, when we're looking at the facial expressions of those beautiful children who were responding to affective stimulus, the qualia of their experience may not be of the same nature as the qualia of me or my child, or you know, someone with an intact cortical structure as well as brainstem. And is it therefore possible that the essence of experiencing a full qualia consciousness is not solely dependent on the brainstem, but is a function of the whole system operating in concert? And then finally, my question is related to my pain work, because we are moving more and more into this predictive processing model that you beautifully alluded to towards the end. And I don't know whether within the predictive processing model, you know, using the Bayesian brain idea, but certainly I have come to the conclusion that many of the patients who I see who have an experience of pain, they have at the core of that a sense of injustice and often serious psychological traumas within their life. The team within which I operate, we have started to move to a notion that the pain experience is generated more from the amygdala and the unresolved traumas in a John Sarno type model, and much less to do with afferent nociceptive pain information. So
Yes.
I don't know if you can define a question or a series of questions within that, but I'd love to hear what your comments are.
Questions. I see three questions in what you've said, Terry.
I started off with three. So I'll be quiet.
The first one, you know, to do with the locked-in syndrome. It is indeed a brainstem syndrome, but the lesion is in the descending pyramidal tracts, the motor tracts. So there's a complete lesion in those cases of the motor tracts, which makes them unable to move. So there's nothing to do with consciousness. This is not to do with the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray. I'm not speaking about the brainstem in its totality. I'm speaking about these core brainstem nuclei responsible for the arousal of the ascending arousal systems, as opposed to the descending motor system. So in those patients, the locked-in patients, and I've had a few such patients in my time, you know, they can be fully conscious, no different from you and me, apart from the fact that they can't express it. There's no way in which they can move and communicate what it is that's on their minds. And as you say, we're now developing new technologies, new ways of being able to release them from this literal bondage. So the two things are, the two aspects of the brainstem there are dealing with entirely different functions. The second point about the nature of the experience in these patients, the hydranencephalic children, you're saying, you know, is it really the same as yours and mine? And please, I don't want to be misunderstood on that score. Absolutely, it's not the same as yours and mine. I'm not claiming that they are like the locked-in patients who are like you and me in their consciousness. These patients are affectively conscious, but not cognitively conscious. So they have feelings, but they cannot possibly reflect on what those feelings are about. In other words, there's no conscious cognition, no conscious perception even that corresponds with the feelings. Feelings guide behavior even when you don't know where they've come from. You know, so these children are able to act on the basis of their feelings, but their consciousness is very different from yours and mine. When you say, this is still part of your second question, isn't it therefore the whole system that we should be talking about? If we want to understand consciousness, we shouldn't look only to its brainstem foundations. We should surely include in our conception, you know, the upper stories of conscious cognition. And yes, that is true. if we want to understand consciousness in its totality. But it's not as if these are just two equal parts of consciousness. There's the cognitive type and the affective type, because the cognitive type is contingent upon the affective type. So you can't have the cognitive type without the affective type. The affective type is therefore foundational, which is very important in terms of trying to understand, like Leila was asking, to understand what is it for, what does it do, the mechanism of consciousness, to recognize that the foundational form is affect. Affect drives the whole thing, really makes a difference to our understanding. And then also this crucial point, Terry, that in those kids with no cortex, they are conscious without the affect modulating cortical cognition. So you can have consciousness without the cortical cognition at all. And as I showed, for example, in the positron emission tomography, you can see the affective activation is actually in the brainstem. So it can have consciousness without the totality of the functional system. That's the point that I'm making. Not that the consciousness is the same without the totality of the system, but rather that the elementary foundational form. And if we're wanting to understand the essence of what consciousness is, how it comes about, what it does, we need to reduce it to its basic form. The big mistake that my field has made is to take the most complex form of consciousness known to the universe, the human reflective cognition, and use this as our model example. That if you start at that end of the puzzle, you shouldn't be surprised if you get hopelessly lost. As regards your last point about pain, I am very much of that school, what you refer to. I'm a Bayesian predictive processing person, and I hold to the views about pain that you allude to, that it's not a matter of bottom-up, nociceptive sensory processing, but rather I don't like to say top-down, I rather like to say something from the inside out, that if the subject brings, makes meaning of their experience, and that thing that comes from the inside out, the consciousness, is affective. That's the point that I'm making. And pain is an affect. I think that's a crucial, the cortical aspect of pain really has to do with the localization of where is this pain coming from. But the periaqueductal gray, which you well know, has everything to do with the generation and modulation of pain. That's an affect generating structure. And so the sorts of phenomena, clinical phenomena that you're talking about, where the experience of pain by our patients with so-called functional neurological disorders and so on, that it doesn't come from nociceptors, it comes from their very cells. So I agree very much with that view, but I think it's entirely compatible with the point that I'm making about the affective nature of consciousness and the fact that it comes from within rather than flows in with our sensory perceptual information. It is something that comes from the core of the brain stem, and we bestow meaning upon our perceptual and other cognitive representations from within, from the subject. Thanks.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Mark. But we've got 2 minutes, so I don't know if we should squeeze in one, or we've got another talk on the next one on the 3rd of June. But
yeah, I'm talking about brain mechanisms of dreaming then, but I feel very bad about Shea Shannon. She's been sitting there with her hand up all this time.
Let's do it. Here we go. Yeah,
good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I'll be quick. I just wanted to hear a little bit about dissociation and how it connects.
Dissociation. Oh, well, you say that you're going to be very quick, and then you ask a whopping great question like that. So, once you start talking about defense mechanisms, you're talking about cortical processes, you're talking about higher cognitive processes, the ways in which we dissociate ourselves from our affects. So it doesn't apply only to dissociation. All defense mechanisms ultimately are directed against unpleasant feelings. It's ways of avoiding unpleasant feelings, and there are all kinds of cognitive gymnastics that we can use to do that. And that's why I made the point with reference to that quotation from Freud, that I'm speaking about feelings which we feel. I fully acknowledge that there are ways in which we can cognitively escape, remove ourselves from our feelings, and dissociation is sadly a very common way in which we do that, especially in traumatized individuals. I know that you know all of that, but I'm just wanting to make the point in the context of what I've talked about, that defense mechanisms are top-down things. Defense mechanisms are cortical and cognitive things that we use to defend ourselves against these affects, which are the demands, the needs, the problems that we have to solve. But the point is that if you avoid your problems, it doesn't make them go away. And so that's why, rather than have defenses, we should have psychoanalysis. Little joke. So thank you very much. The discussion is always the most interesting part for me, as I said, and I appreciated this was a particularly interesting discussion. So thank you for that. And as Mike said, I'll be talking on this platform again soon on the topic of dreams and what my other career tells us about the psychodynamics of dreaming.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers.
Bye-bye all. Thank you.
Bye all. Bye all.
Cheers.